Hi everyone, Kurt here again for another video for our testing and evaluation in English course. Let's jump right in. All right, so today we're going to be talking about assessing grammar and vocabulary. So we'll have a quick review. We've covered all of the individual skills: listening, speaking, reading, writing, and this is going to be the last one. So remember, there's going to be a lot of overlap between the different types of testing items. You're going to see items that we saw in listening, reading, writing, but remember, it's all about your focus of assessment. And it's very important when you design your tests that you set up your test specifications to show what it is you want to measure. So if you're testing grammar, okay, what does that mean? If you're testing vocabulary, what does that mean? How is that different from testing reading? And it's really essential for students learning that you define it and then you actually measure what you're supposed to, right? We really care so much about validity when we're doing our assessments. Practicality is always nice, but as a classroom teacher, it's not always it's not always easy to have practicality because it takes time, but it's essential that your tests are valid. Okay, so we'll start with a few questions here. Number one, what does it mean to know grammar? You know how much I love the word know. It's very vague, but let's go with it here. What does it mean to know vocabulary, phonology, and discourse rules? How do we assess grammar? Sorry, I should have mentioned first that we're going to start with grammar, and vocabulary will come later on in this presentation. Should we assess comprehension or production in terms of grammar? And how do we assess implicit knowledge of forms? Remember, when you learn grammar, not all of it you learn is going to be from the teacher's explicit instruction. You are going to implicitly learn rules you don't even know that you know. So how do we assess those? Okay, so we'll go through some theory and go through some different examples and items here today. Okay, so in terms of what is grammatical knowledge, it can come in three forms. Okay, the first is the grammatical form. That is the actual structure of language. Those are the rules that you learn in class, or maybe the syntax. Okay. The second is the grammatical meanings of the forms. Okay. And then the third is the pragmatic meaning. That is the use in a given context. Okay. So how to use the grammar appropriately based on who you're talking to, what speech function you're trying to do, where you are, the time, things like that. Okay. So looking specifically at grammatical form, remember, we're looking here at how to assess grammar. So what does it mean? Okay, so in terms of morphology and syntax, to have this type of knowledge, it's to know how the words are formed and strung together. And both of them contribute to the linguistic accuracy of a language. So they both need to be assessed. Okay, grammatical meaning. So remember, we've got three types, right, of knowledge for grammatical knowledge. And the second one was meaning. So this includes the literal and intended meanings of a form. And it can include the meaningfulness of a language as well. Okay, and then we have pragmatic meaning. So as I mentioned before, this is the appropriate language choices a learner makes depending on the context. All right, so moving on to a little bit more about grammatical knowledge. So knowledge of form, meaning, and use occur at the sentence level and beyond, also at the discourse level. This includes rules for cohesion, information management, and interactional knowledge. Pragmatic meaning depends on contextual, sociolinguistic, sociocultural, psychological, and rhetorical meanings of the context, and they can occur at sentence and discourse level. So it's not very simply defined. And you can assess any of these. Of course, when we get to the pragmatic level, That's not as easy to assess at the very basic levels of language learning, especially some of the functions of language. Maybe that's later on, but for those of you who are senior high school teachers, then yeah, you should be assessing all three. Okay, so we're going to start with selected response types of grammar test items. So for this type of selected response, the input we give the students can be language or non-language. So remember, non-language could be gestures, it could be pictures, it could be graphs, it could be anything. The students' responses are often scored dichotomously. That means you either give them 0 or 1, correct or incorrect. It's possible to give partial credit if you include meaning. Okay. So first of all, we can use multiple choice tasks for selected response. As we know, we've talked about multiple choice a lot throughout this course. The advantages are practicality and administration, but the disadvantages are it's difficult to create the items. And when I want to add to this one, it's difficult to create items that are truly assessing what you say they are assessing. And we're going to look at some items in a minute. The disadvantages are also, students can guess. And as you know, they become good guessers the more they take these type of multiple choice tests. And of course, the items are very inauthentic a lot of the time. Okay, so here are some examples. Now, these are very basic. You've seen them a million times in your own learning experiences, but what you should be looking at here is what is it that we are assessing. So here we're looking at grammatical form. Okay, so we have this short dialogue and then we have our 4 responses. So you should be asking yourself every time you see these, what's the key and what is actually being assessed? Because remember, we are assessing grammar here. We're not assessing reading, and we're not assessing vocabulary, and we're not assessing writing, obviously. All right, so all responses show the intended meaning, right? There's no yes, there's no no, so we don't need to interpret what it means. It's only assessing grammatical form, right? I love to, I do, so did I, did I, and so did I. All positive, but it's all about the grammar here. Okay. Now we can also assess grammatical meaning. So do you have plans for tonight? Not really. Thanks, but I have a final paper to write. Okay, so we have 4 different questions. They are all grammatically correct. So now it's all about the meaning. Now you may be asking yourself, isn't this reading? And that's why when we did the reading section, remember at the very basic level, we said those are our grammar reading items. So yeah, they're very similar here. But the most important part to notice is whether you want to call this a grammar question or a reading question, it's all about what is your purpose of assessment. Here, we want to assess the meaning, not the form. Okay, so as I mentioned here, only meaning is assessed. However, it is possible to do grammatical form and meaning. Now, I told you before, in multiple choice, you shouldn't have more than one thing tested, but it's still just grammar, okay? All we're assessing here is the grammar. We're not assessing vocabulary and grammar, so it could be considered okay, but I may argue here that this type of item is more confusing for students when you are assessing form and meaning at the same time. Personally, I would not do it, but it is possible depending on your students. And I know that the standardized tests will do it. Okay, so you can see here in this one, both grammatical form and meaning are being assessed. So the students have to be able to interpret the answer from the item. Okay. Another type we can do is editing or finding the incorrect answer. So this one is also grammatical form and meaning. Students read the paragraph and they have to say which one is the mistake. Okay, moving on. We can also do discrimination tasks. Now, this one is also grammatical form and meaning. So you see the item on the page. They have to choose the correct picture, A or B, to match the sentence below. The sentence is, she delivered it to him. Now, this is, I would ask you to pause the video and assess this item on your own. We're going to do this in class as well if you happen to watch this before class. See if you can find some issues with this item, and then in class we will discuss it. Okay. All right. Next, we can do noticing tasks. We're still at the selected response, okay? But this one is not multiple choice anymore. We can do noticing tasks or consciousness raising tasks. Here, students attend consciously to form and or meaning, and the intention is to become aware of specific language features. So when we teach grammar, so not testing right now, teach, we have various methods that we can use, right? We can teach explicitly, or we can teach implicitly. And when we teach explicitly, we can also use the deductive approach or the inductive approach. And one way to teach your students is through the assessment. So if you use an item like this, okay, this one is all on meaning. In the following passage, underline would when it is used to refer to the habitual past. Circle would when it refers to the present or future. And so now in the assessment, students are focusing directly on the form. And this one will have a lot of good washback, because no matter how well they do, once they get their test back, they're going to see what they got right, what they got wrong, and they're going to be asking why. So it's a good way to kind of let them learn implicitly, and then later on you can still explain the form to them after the test. Okay, next type is limited production. So in a limited production item, the input is going to be, again, language or non-language. The input should be single sentence or longer. Now, once we get to production, though, it typically could be more than one correct answer. So now your scoring could be dichotomous, whether you're controlling the answer for one correct one or not. Or you can start giving partial credit, especially if you are assessing both grammar form and meaning. So, for example, they get the form correct, but they get the meaning wrong. Or they get the meaning wrong, but the form correct. Maybe you can still give them partial credit. Okay, so for example, we've got this one, which is a gap-filling task, where we are looking at grammatical form. And you can see here it is a fill in the blank. Sorry for the stuff popping up on my screen. Okay, sorry, back to my train of thought here. Okay, so here they need to fill in the blanks, and typically you will choose which words you want them to focus on, but you can see here that this is definitely a grammar type task, only on grammatical form. The criteria for correctness is grammar. So look, a book right before I go to sleep. Okay, so we're talking about a habit, right? So probably the correct answer will be, I always read a book right before I go to sleep, or I usually read a book, or I read a book right before I go to sleep. It should be okay. Okay, I have been reading, recently I have been reading biographies. Okay, then the biographies of Charlie Chaplin and Mahatma Gandhi. So I have read the biographies of Charlie Chaplin and Gandhi, and for the past few nights, I have been reading about Oprah Winfrey. So you can see every single blank is the word read. It's just about getting the correct form. So the teacher has controlled it in a way to focus specifically on form. Okay, now we could do form and meaning again. So the Mississippi River, also called the Great River, is the longest river in the United States. The river something at Lake Itasca in the state of Minnesota. So there's a few options here, right? The river begins, the river starts, could be some answers. Then the river ends at the Gulf of Mexico, where it over 500,000 cubic feet of water into the Gulf. So again, they have to choose a correct answer with the correct form. So this is more like almost like a cloze test. Okay, at limited production stage, we can also do short answer tasks. So the input is in the form of a question or questions after reading a passage, or again, you can give them oral or visual stimulus. So it could be reading, could be listening, could be both. Responses can be a word or longer, and again, you can use dichotomous or partial credit scoring. Okay, so here's an example where it's focused on form and meaning. So read the paragraph, answer each question below in a sentence or two. Now remember, this is not a reading comprehension task, so the questions need to be based on grammatical form or grammatical meaning. Okay? Or you could do something like this. Look at the picture, answer the question below. What is the woman doing? Something a little bit simpler. All right, now limited production, we can also do dialogue completion tasks. So here, the input will be a short conversation or dialogue. Blanks are left and answers should be grammatically correct. Okay, so for example, here is one with form and meaning. The directions are to fill in the blanks in the conversation with one or more words that are grammatically correct in the context. So with context there, it means the meaning is also important. So we have the conversation between Mayumi and Karina. How was your trip to Los Angeles? Now you can see below, Mayumi says, I knew you would enjoy your visit, which means Karina has to have some kind of positive response. Okay, so you've seen these before as well. Form and meaning. All right, now we're gonna move on to extended production, which is the last type of grammar assessment type we're gonna talk about today. So here, input is usually a prompt. It can vary in length, and again, it could be language or non-language. The purpose is to obtain larger amounts of language for more creative construction. But just keep in mind, this is not a writing assignment. It's still about grammar. Now here we know that more authentic language will be used, and it's more open-ended. And it will be scored probably using a rating scale now. Now, it's really important that you first design the grammatical ability that you're going to assess before you make your rating scale. So here's an example that comes from the textbook, but it's typical to use this type of 5 or even 6-point scale if you want to have a top score of 5. So here, it's just based on whatever grammatical form or overall grammar that they are assessing. So see, it's all based on grammar. There's no organization, there's no cohesion. It's just grammar. And that's what makes this a grammar assessment. Okay, you can also do information gap tasks. So here, there's some need for negotiation, which makes it appropriate to assess grammatical knowledge for communicating functional meaning. So usually when we have some kind of information gap task, we do it in speaking and listening class or some kind of integrated task-based class. But here, you can still do the exact same thing, but only assess the grammar knowledge and their ability to use grammar appropriately. And here is where we introduce pragmatic knowledge. So you can also assess like their politeness, formality, appropriateness, and so on when they're using language to talk to each other. So this kind of task aims to measure their knowledge of question formation, interactional forms, meaning, request for clarification, repair, things like that. Okay, so we can do, as I just mentioned, grammatical form, grammatical meaning, and pragmatic use. So this is a much more challenging type task. It needs to be designed well to assess it properly. So here's the directions of one example. Working with a partner, ask questions to find out about the other painter. Then, using all your information, prepare a short report comparing the two famous painters. So here is the input. Test taker A looks at Claude Monet. Test taker B looks at Van Gogh, and they have their information. Now, I'm test taker A. I need to give a report about Van Gogh. So I need to ask test taker B all of the right questions based on the information that I have. So I know I got Claude Monet, so I will have to ask them, okay, so who is your artist? They tell me. Oh, what country is Van Gogh from? What style of painting did he do? And so on. And then I prepare my report. Now the teacher will either assess the final report or actually the interaction part, which could be challenging, right? So maybe you need to record their interaction if that's what you're going to do. Or if you want it to be more practical, you just assess their final report. Okay, you can also do role play or simulation tasks. So again, we usually think about role play for a speaking task, but you can do it for grammar as well. So the input will ask the test takers to take a role or to simulate a situation to solve a problem, make a decision, perform a transaction, and so on. It contains large amounts of language, right? And as I said, you can use it to measure their knowledge of the grammatical form, meaning, and pragmatic use again. Oops, sorry, double slide. Okay, so here's an example of one particular task, but you can do this with anything. What's important is you give them a scenario that they are really able to do. They have the background knowledge already of how to perform this task. Like, for example, you see this one, your state is facing a budget cut. Now, if I gave this to my students here in Taiwan, they may have a really hard time with this because maybe, first of all, the government in Taiwan might be different than the government in the USA. And maybe at their age, they don't really know a lot about how economics work and how the government has budgets. They may not have any type of experience, but definitely when you're teaching at the junior and senior high school level, they likely will not know how to do something like this. So, of course, the scenario has to match what they're able to do because remember, you are assessing their ability in grammar. If you give them a task that's too hard or beyond their ability to produce language, then how are you going to assess their grammar if they're not really able to talk about it? So it has to be something familiar. You are not testing their knowledge of economics. You're testing their grammar. Okay, so now that's it for grammar. Let's move on to vocabulary. And at the beginning of this part, I have a little bit of theory and some definitions to share to really understand what does it mean when we're talking about vocabulary, just like we did with grammar. So let's start with some terms. Okay, and the first two terms on this page are tokens and types. If you ever go to grad school and you really dive deep on vocabulary learning, this is something that you will learn for sure. Maybe you already have in your undergrad studies. Okay, so tokens are all the words in a paragraph. I have an example paragraph up above about fake news. And then types. So types are words that are different form, no repeats. You don't count the different, if the same word is used twice, like help and help, you don't count it again. Okay, but different forms are different types. So politician and politicians are two types, but they are from the same word family. So it's really it's really important that you know the difference here. Okay, the type means a different form, but family means you're using the same word. You're just changing the form. Now, why this is important is vocabulary tests will not test two derivatives of the same word family. So in my example of politician and politicians, you won't do that on a vocabulary test because then it becomes a grammar test. So remember that. Okay. More function words. Function words, sometimes they're also called structure words. These are the little words like prepositions, articles, conjunctions, and their purpose is only for grammatical function. They help put the sentence together. Content words are nouns, or verbs, or adjectives, adverbs, And these are the words that give meaning. When we give a vocabulary test, we typically focus on content words. If you're using the function words, then it's more of a grammar test. All right, at the bottom, you can also, it doesn't have to be single words though, right? You can do lexical phrases, compound nouns, phrasal verbs, idioms, prefabricated language, like those are words that function as a single unit. How are you today? Things like that, these kind of expressions. These can also show up on a vocabulary test. Okay, we also have polywords. These are short fixed phrases that perform a variety of functions, like for the most part, so to speak, wait a minute. We also have institutionalized expressions. These are longer utterances that are fixed in form. You cannot change it. Pot calling the kettle black. Nice to meet you, as I said. How's it going? See you later. Okay. Phrasal constraints. These are medium length phrases that have a basic structure with one or two slots that can be filled by various words or phrases. So things like yours truly, sincerely, as far as I know, as far as I can tell, as far as I'm aware. And also sentence builders, phrases that provide the framework for a complete sentence with one or two slots where whole ideas can be expressed. That reminds me of, on the other hand, not only this, but also this. Very common ones that you have had to learn in your English journey. So all of these could be considered vocabulary. All right. Most vocabulary tests focus on single word items for ease of understanding and scoring. However, it's not impossible to use larger lexical items. It's just that they allow for more open-ended responses, and it makes it more challenging to design and score. You have to predict all the possible choices so that when you check it, you don't spend all of your time thinking, is this answer correct? Is this answer correct? Is this answer correct? And so on. Okay, so just like I did with grammar, let's do it with vocabulary, with my favorite word, know. What does it mean to know a word? So that's what we're assessing, right? We want to assess whether students know the word. They're able to understand it and use it. So what does it mean? Okay, so if we look at some theory, some of these theories go way back. Let's define lexical knowledge. So from Richards, and Richards has a lot of assumptions I'm going to share. The first is that a native speaker of a language will continue to expand their vocabulary as they get older. But syntax develops comparatively little in adult life. So as a child, native speakers we're talking about here. As a child, you learn your grammar quite young, but your vocabulary continues to grow and grow and grow for the rest of your life. And you should notice that the older you get, probably the more complex vocabulary knowledge that you have. Okay, knowing a word means knowing the degree of probability of encountering that word in speech or print. So for many words, we also know the sort of words most likely to be found associated with the word, like our collocations. Knowing a word implies knowing the limitations imposed on the use of the word according to variations of function and situation. So when you can use it, when you can't, when it's appropriate, things like that. Okay, knowing a word means knowing the syntactic behavior associated with that word. And it also entails knowledge of the underlying form of the word and the derivations that can be made from it. So it's not so simple as just being able to identify it. Okay, it entails knowledge of the network of associations between that word and other words. It means knowing the semantic value of the word, and it means knowing many of the different meanings associated with the word. For example, if I tell you or ask you, what about the word dirty? What does the word dirty mean? And in your brain, you should start making some visualizations of the word dirty. It might be pictures, or it might be situations, or it might be other words. So maybe you pictured a child with dirty hands, Or maybe you pictured your bedroom that's got stuff everywhere. So it's not necessarily dirty, it's messy. Or maybe you visualized a person who says inappropriate things. Okay, so see, lots of different ways to go with this. And sometimes these negative words are used in a positive way. Like if you know the word filthy, filthy means dirty, but actually in sports, if someone makes like a really good move, they'll say, oh, that was filthy. It's a positive now. So yeah, it's not just as simple as the first definition. Okay, now nation, many years ago, defined vocabulary into two groups. We have the receptive and the productive vocabulary. So when we're assessing, is it just enough that they can understand it by looking at it, or do they have to produce it? And then Chappell defined explicit knowledge and the ability to put vocabulary knowledge to use accurately in a given context. So Chappell has some abilities here. The context of vocabulary use, vocabulary knowledge and fundamental processes, metacognitive strategies for vocabulary use. As you can see, this is a very complex issue, what it means to know and understand, which is why when you were younger in my courses, when you wrote learning objectives, if you said things like they will know the target vocabulary, I will say to you, too vague. What does know mean? Okay, so let's move on. We also have vocabulary in context, right? So actually the environment where the word is used is very important, and that can include pragmatic knowledge. So if you are talking about British English to table or American English to table, the meanings are the opposite. In America, to table something means to, like if we're going to table our discussion, it means we're going to stop it for a little bit and we are going to talk about it later. But in British English, it means the opposite. It means we are going to start talking about the topic now. I hope I got that right. Okay, moving on. Now, the fundamental processes of vocabulary acquisition. So learners' knowledge of word characteristics, perceiving different forms, recognizing linguistic roots, guessing in context, and knowing parts of speech. All of these are included as a student or as a person acquires vocabulary, and so actually can assess them all as well. Okay, now metacognitive strategies. So if you've ever learned this word or haven't, I guess I should say, metacognitive means that this is the knowledge you have of your ability or of your knowledge. So in your brain, you use certain strategies and you know what your strategies are, what you do to learn vocabulary. So for example, we use the following strategies. We try to read illegible handwriting. We have avoidance strategies where we use a different word when we're unsure about the correct usage or pronunciation or grammatical form. These things happen all the time. Now, we rarely assess these strategies, but you should be aware that learners are using them, and you should encourage them to use good strategies when they're learning and trying to understand vocabulary. Okay, so some considerations in designing assessment tasks before we get to the actual example items. So of course, as always, clarify your purpose. What are you doing? Are you assessing their receptive knowledge? Are you assessing their strategies? Are you assessing their productive knowledge? Are you assessing the relationship between different words? You have to know your purpose before you just start randomly designing vocabulary tasks. Okay, you should assess a number of high frequency words a learner knows. Assess the learner's progress. Identify vocabulary that needs further attention. That's why we have these tests, right? It's not just to prepare them for more tests. We want to know what they know and what they need to learn. And of course, you should have some kind of vocabulary summative assessment at the end of your course or your semester. Okay, you need to define your construct. So as I mentioned before, if you're assessing vocabulary, what does that mean? How do researchers define vocabulary? If it's receptive vocabulary, what does that mean? So you need to know what that means before you design your test items. Now, the construct can be based on your syllabus, which could come from the Ministry of Education, or you can base it on theory. Personally, I think that you should base it on both. Don't blindly just follow the syllabus that you're given. You should also have some theoretical knowledge of what vocabulary learning means so that you can make the best test possible. Now, the syllabus approach, of course, is more appropriate for language teachers, and your list of words may already be supplied in relation to learning objectives, and those come from the textbook. So when it comes to choosing which words should be assessed, of course, you want to take that from the material that you're given because students need those words on their standardized tests. But in terms of what it is you're actually assessing, I still suggest that you base some of it on theory. Okay, so select your target words. Teaching and testing are better served, as I mentioned, with high frequency words, because this is the basis for all language learners. To learn language, you need high frequency words. Low frequency words like academic vocabulary, specialized, technical, subtechnical, it's more appropriate for ESP courses or content courses like bilingual education classes. When you're learning science, of course you need to learn those science words. But in your English class, try to focus more on high frequency words. Okay, then you need to determine the mode of performance. So is it going to be recognition or comprehension? Vocabulary recognition, for example, the word deviate means, they choose the correct answer. Is it going to be recall and use? So, for example, vocabulary recall, the restaurant is so popular that you have to make so here they have to spell the word, right? So this is a word that you've asked them to learn, and now it's not just so this is our productive vocabulary, right? On the previous slide, this is our receptive, productive. Okay, here we go. So we're gonna start now with our assessment tasks. So the first type we're gonna do is receptive vocabulary. For practicality issues, single sentences are often used in classroom tests. They're easier to check, they're easier to design, and context may or may not play a role depending on your design and depending on your purpose. Okay, so I'll give you a couple examples of what I'm talking about. So here is vocabulary in a one sentence context. Wrong context. It means just one sentence only. And this is a high frequency word. My grandfather is a very independent person. Now there are 4 definitions here, which means, and there's no context. The sentence does not give us any clues what independent means. And so you have to know the meaning of the word independent. We are testing their knowledge of the meaning of the word. Okay, so you can see the 4 responses there. These are all attributes of a person, which makes it much harder for the student to guess, right? That's one of the strategies you will use to make sure that they're not guessing. Okay, next one. This is one that's in context, and this is a low frequency word. Now, there could be some arguing here whether this is reading or vocabulary, and in all honesty, it's both, but we're still focused on an individual word, so we'll call this a vocabulary item. Now, the word that we want them to know is hazardous, but this is a low frequency word, and so if you haven't asked them to memorize it, then you need to have context clues so that they can make some inference. So you can see the words that are in red, fatal accidents, that will allow students to be able to guess what hazardous means. Okay, you can also do vocabulary matching at the receptive level. There's no explanation needed here. And you can also do word association. This one's a little bit more challenging because the word is edit, and they have to choose the word that is a synonym, best matches the meaning of the word edit. But you can see there are a few words that could distract students, like publishing or text. These are maybe not mathematics, but definitely these two. Of course, the correct answer here is revise, but you can do things like this to see their knowledge of word association. Okay, productive vocabulary now. So in this type, sentence completion is very common, used by teachers everywhere for many types of tests. So here we have fill in the blank. Directions are write one word for each blank. Okay, so they have to focus on meaning here, and you can tell that the blanks that are chosen are specifically chosen to test the words that they should have learned. It's not reading comprehension. Remember that. It's vocabulary. So these are words that students should have been asked to learn. Okay, you can also do selective deletion. Now, we've done this before in reading, which is the close test. Remember, the close test, we will delete every 7 words. But in this one, you specifically select the vocabulary that you want to delete so that you can focus on vocabulary that you want them to know or understand or learn. But in this type, it's more challenging because form and meaning are both necessary. So it is very similar to the grammar test we did before. But it's not the grammatical meaning, it's the vocabulary meaning here. Okay, and that's it, everybody. Those are all the items that I have for you today. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.